But behind the sold-out arenas and patriotic lyrics, some stars were fighting a very different battle. This is not a story about temptation alone, but about compulsion, secrecy, and the quiet destruction that followed. In this video, we look at 12 country music stars whose uncontrolled personal lives didn't just damage relationships. They dismantled careers, families, and legacies from the inside out. George Jones. At his peak, George Jones was not just another country star. He was the voice. Fellow musicians called him the greatest singer the genre had ever produced, a man who could break hearts with a single line. His records sold, his shows filled venues, and his name carried a kind of reverence in Nashville that few ever achieved. From the outside, Jones represented everything country music wanted to celebrate: raw emotion, authenticity, and tradition. Behind that legend, however, was a private life spiraling out of control. Jones openly admitted later in life that he was incapable of moderation in almost any part of his existence. While alcohol and drugs were the most visible demons, his compulsive relationships ran just as deep. Multiple affairs became routine, not isolated mistakes. Long stretches on the road, constant adoration, and a lack of boundaries created a cycle he neither questioned nor resisted for years. What began as indulgence gradually turned into a destructive pattern. The consequences were devastating, especially for his marriage to Tammy Wynette. Their relationship became one of the most famous and painful partnerships in country music history. Jones's repeated infidelities, emotional absence, and reckless behavior eroded any sense of stability. Wynette eventually walked away, not because of a single betrayal, but because the pattern never stopped. The industry watched closely. Promoters grew hesitant. Labels became frustrated. Jones missed shows, arrived intoxicated, or failed to show up at all. His reputation shifted from genius to liability. As the damage mounted, Nashville quietly began to distance itself. Jones still had hits, but trust was gone. Contracts became harder to secure. Insurance costs for tours skyrocketed. The man once treated as irreplaceable became someone the business feared. For years, he lived on the edge of total professional exile, surviving more on his legacy than his reliability. Friends later described a man trapped by compulsions he did not know how to control. Only later in life did Jones acknowledge the full cost. He spoke candidly about the women he hurt, the relationships he destroyed, and the years he lost. Sobriety brought clarity, but it could not undo the damage. His late career revival restored some respect, but never erased the scars left on his personal life. George Jones died recognized as a legend, yet his story remains a cautionary one. Unmatched talent can survive almost anything, but unchecked compulsion eventually demands a price no career can fully repay. Waylon Jennings. Waylon Jennings built his legend on rebellion. At a time when Nashville demanded obedience, he refused to bow. His voice, his sound, and his attitude reshaped country music and gave birth to the outlaw movement. Fans saw a fearless individualist, a man who lived by his own rules and answered to no one. On stage, Jennings projected control and confidence, a symbol of freedom in an industry obsessed with polish. Off stage, that same defiance spilled into his personal life in ways that slowly dismantled everything around him. Jennings later admitted that excess defined his years at the top. Cocaine addiction was the most publicized part of his downfall, but behind it existed a deeper pattern of compulsive behavior, including repeated affairs and emotional detachment. Life on the road blurred boundaries. Admiration became entitlement. Relationships became disposable. Jennings was rarely present, even when he was physically home. The impact on his family was severe. His early marriages collapsed under the weight of infidelity, addiction, and prolonged absence. Trust eroded completely. By the time he married Jessie Coulter, the damage was already deeply ingrained. Coulter later spoke about years defined by betrayal, fear, and instability. Jennings was not cruel by intent, but he was consumed by impulses he did not restrain. Love existed, but discipline did not. Professionally, the consequences followed quickly. His addictions made him unreliable. Tours became chaotic. Studio sessions were delayed or abandoned. The industry that once feared his independence began to fear his unpredictability even more. While his fame protected him longer than most, it did not shield him indefinitely. By the early 1980s, Jennings was burning through money, goodwill, and physical health at an alarming rate. Several close friends died from similar excesses, serving as warnings he initially ignored. The turning point came not from success, but from exhaustion. Jennings later described a moment of realization. Freedom without control had become another kind of prison. Quitting cocaine was a brutal process, but it forced him to confront the damage he had inflicted on those closest to him. Some relationships survived, others were beyond repair. His career stabilized, but it never fully returned to its earlier dominance. In hindsight, Waylon Jennings understood that rebellion alone was never the problem. It was the belief that consequences could always be outrun. His story remains one of country music's most powerful contradictions. A man who fought for artistic freedom, yet nearly lost everything to compulsions that no amount of fame could justify or contain. Kris Kristofferson. Kris Kristofferson entered country music as an anomaly. A Rhodes Scholar, a former Army helicopter pilot, and a poet with a battered guitar, he did not look or sound like Nashville's idea of a star. Yet his songwriting changed the genre. His lyrics were vulnerable, literate, and painfully honest. Songs like Sunday Morning Comin' Down gave voice to loneliness in a way country music had rarely dared before. Success arrived quickly, and with it came a level of freedom few artists ever experienced. That freedom, however, came at a cost Kristofferson did not fully grasp at the time. Fame opened doors everywhere, including into his personal life. Long tours, constant admiration, and a lack of routine blurred the lines between intimacy and impulse. Kristofferson later spoke openly about his inability to commit during those years. Relationships overlapped. Emotional attachments were started without endings. What he once described as living honestly was, in practice, a pattern of compulsive entanglements that left damage behind. His marriages bore the brunt of that instability. Kristofferson's early relationships collapsed under the weight of absence, infidelity, and emotional distance. Partners often found themselves competing not just with his career, but with the chaos surrounding it. Unlike some of his peers, Kristofferson did not deny these failures later in life. He acknowledged that his romantic life had become reckless, driven less by affection than by momentum and opportunity. The consequences were not dramatic scandals, but quiet implosions that stripped away trust, one relationship at a time. Professionally, the fallout was more subtle, but no less real. While his songwriting remained respected, his image grew complicated. Nashville was unsure how to place him. He was admired, but not embraced. Film roles and cross-genre success pulled him further from the country mainstream, creating distance rather than security. Over time, the industry's enthusiasm cooled. Kristofferson never lost credibility, but he lost stability. The constant reinvention came with emotional exhaustion. Later in life, Kristofferson described a slow reckoning. Sobriety and age brought clarity, not redemption. He understood that the people most affected by his compulsions were not critics or executives, but those who loved him privately. Some wounds healed, others remained permanent. His legacy as an artist endured, but his personal story carried a quieter lesson. Kris Kristofferson proved that intelligence and self-awareness do not automatically protect against self-destruction. Talent can open every door, but without restraint, it also removes the walls that once kept chaos out. In the end, his greatest honesty came not through his songs, but through admitting the damage done when freedom was mistaken for control. Johnny Paycheck. Johnny Paycheck never fit comfortably into Nashville's idea of a country star. His voice carried pain, defiance, and barely contained rage, and that intensity followed him off stage. When Take This Job and Shove It turned him into a household name, Paycheck suddenly had fame without any internal structure to support it. Success amplified traits that had always been there: impulsiveness, volatility, and a deep disregard for consequences. Paycheck's personal life quickly became a revolving door of chaos. He moved from one relationship to another with little pause, often overlapping and fueled by alcohol, drugs, and constant anger. Compulsive sexual behavior was not a side issue in his life. It was woven into a larger pattern of recklessness. Women came and went, trust never formed, and intimacy was replaced by confrontation. Those close to him later described a man who confused dominance with connection and excitement with meaning. The damage extended far beyond broken relationships. Paycheck's behavior alienated managers, band members, and label executives alike. He was known for violent outbursts, jealousy, and unpredictable mood swings. Tours became unstable, contracts were strained. His reputation shifted from outlaw rebel to uncontrollable liability. Unlike some peers whose excesses were quietly tolerated, Paycheck burned bridges openly and repeatedly. The turning point came in 1985, when Paycheck shot a man during a confrontation and was later sentenced to prison. While the crime itself was not directly tied to his sexual compulsions, it emerged from the same unchecked impulses that defined his life. By the time he entered prison, his career was in ruins, his finances depleted, and most personal relationships severed. The industry had moved on, relieved to distance itself from someone who had become impossible to insure or manage. After his release, Paycheck attempted a comeback. He still possessed the voice, but the infrastructure was gone. Trust could not be rebuilt overnight. His health declined, and opportunities were limited. The relationships destroyed during his years of excess did not return. What remained was a man forced to live with the accumulated consequences of decades spent refusing restraint. Johnny Paycheck's story is one of country music's harshest cautionary tales. He was not undone by a single scandal, but by a lifetime of compulsions left unchecked. Talent kept him afloat longer than most, but it could not save him. In the end, Paycheck died with his legacy defined as much by his self-destruction as by his music, a reminder that rebellion without boundaries eventually turns inward and consumes everything around it. Allan Coe. Allan Coe built his identity on pushing every boundary Nashville tried to enforce. Long before controversy became a marketing tool, Coe lived as if limits simply did not apply to him. His outlaw image was not a costume. It was an extension of a life defined by extremes. At his peak, Coe was celebrated as one of the rawest voices in country music, a songwriter unafraid to explore darkness, isolation, and defiance. Fans admired his refusal to conform. The industry tolerated him because his talent was undeniable. Offstage, however, that same rejection of restraint shaped a personal life marked by chaos. Coe's relationships were numerous, unstable, and often overlapping. Intimacy was fleeting. Commitment was treated as optional. Those who knew him described a man constantly in motion, driven by impulse rather than reflection. Fame intensified these tendencies. Constant attention, easy access, and a self-image built around rebellion removed any remaining barriers. What might have been private flaws became a permanent way of living. The consequences appeared slowly, then all at once. Marriages collapsed. Children grew distant. Trust was replaced by suspicion and resentment. Unlike artists whose scandals erupted publicly, Coe's destruction happened in fragments. Each broken relationship left little media attention, but deep personal damage. Over time, the pattern became impossible to ignore. His personal reputation began to overshadow his music. Promoters hesitated. Collaborators kept their distance. Nashville's patience, never generous to begin with, wore thin. Professionally, Coe's isolation grew. His controversial behavior, combined with increasingly extreme creative choices, pushed him further to the margins. While he retained a loyal fan base, mainstream support faded. Radio airplay declined. Industry doors closed quietly rather than dramatically. Coe was not canceled in a single moment. He was slowly excluded. The outlaw who once thrived on independence found himself cut off from the very system that had once tolerated him. Later in life, Coe showed little interest in rehabilitation or apology. Unlike some peers who reflected publicly on their mistakes, he remained defiant. For him, accountability felt like surrender, yet the cost was evident. His influence endured, but his opportunities narrowed. Relationships lost in earlier years were never repaired. What remained was artistic freedom paired with personal emptiness. Allan Coe's story illustrates a brutal truth about excess and compulsion. When rebellion becomes identity, there is no space left for restraint. His sex-driven impulses were not isolated acts, but part of a larger refusal to accept limits of any kind. In the end, Coe achieved absolute freedom and paid for it with connection, stability, and lasting belonging. Hank Williams Jr. Hank Williams Jr. grew up under a shadow no artist could escape. As the son of Hank Williams, he inherited both a legendary name and an impossible expectation. For years, Nashville tried to shape him into a replica of his father, pushing him into tribute performances rather than allowing him an identity of his own. When he finally broke free and forged his southern rock-infused country sound, success came fast and loud. Arena tours, chart-topping albums, and a fiercely loyal fan base cemented him as a powerhouse in his own right. Away from the stage, however, Williams Jr.'s personal life reflected the same excess that defined his music. Fame, money, and constant adoration fed a long pattern of womanizing and unstable relationships. Multiple marriages ended in divorce, often following the same cycle: absence, infidelity, and emotional distance. Williams Jr. rarely denied these behaviors. In interviews, he framed them as part of a hard-living lifestyle, but the consequences told a harsher story. Relationships were not just strained, they were repeatedly destroyed. The instability extended into his role as a father. Long periods on the road and turbulent personal choices created distance that could not be repaired easily. Those closest to him described a man who loved deeply but lived recklessly, rarely slowing down long enough to protect what mattered most. Over time, the pattern hardened. Commitment became temporary. Intimacy became transactional. The thrill of attention outweighed the discipline required to sustain a family life. Professionally, the fallout was gradual but real. While Williams Jr. remained popular, his reputation within the industry grew complicated. Executives and collaborators viewed him as unpredictable, both personally and publicly. Controversies unrelated to his personal life further amplified that perception. But the foundation had already been laid by years of unchecked behavior. Endorsements disappeared. Corporate partnerships became cautious. His once universal appeal narrowed. Unlike artists whose careers collapsed entirely, Williams Jr. continued performing and recording. Yet the scale of his influence steadily shrank. The man, once positioned as a bridge between traditional country and modern rebellion, became increasingly isolated from Nashville's core. Success remained, but stability did not. The damage to his personal life proved far more permanent than any professional setback. In later years, Williams Jr. showed little interest in rewriting his past. There were no public apologies, no dramatic reckonings. What remained was a career that survived and a personal life marked by fractures that never fully healed. His story underscores a familiar truth in country music. Legacy can protect a career, but it cannot shield a life from the consequences of unchecked impulse. Conway Twitty. For much of his career, Conway Twitty embodied stability. He was marketed as a devoted family man, a romantic voice audiences trusted, and a performer whose smooth delivery made heartbreak feel safe. His transition from early rock and roll into country music was one of the most successful reinventions the genre had ever seen. By the 1970s and early 1980s, Twitty was untouchable, dominating charts and selling out venues with an image built on reliability and emotional sincerity. Behind that carefully managed persona, however, his personal life was far more complicated. Twitty's fame brought constant attention, and over time, boundaries eroded. Multiple relationships developed away from public view, often overlapping and emotionally charged. These were not brief rumors, but sustained entanglements that followed him for years. Those close to him later described a man torn between the image he was expected to maintain and impulses he did not restrain. What appeared calm on the surface concealed ongoing personal turbulence. The cost of that double life was paid at home. His marriage deteriorated as trust collapsed, not because of a single betrayal, but because of a persistent pattern. Absence became normal. Emotional distance replaced partnership. For a man whose music depended on convincing listeners of sincerity, the contradiction grew heavier with time. Twitty rarely addressed these issues publicly, choosing silence over explanation, but the damage inside his private life continued to spread. Professionally, the consequences were subtle but significant. Unlike artists whose scandals exploded into headlines, Twitty's reputation shifted quietly. Industry insiders knew more than fans did. His safe image began to fracture behind the scenes. Sponsors and partners became cautious. While his commercial success continued, the unquestioned trust that once surrounded his name weakened. He remained a star, but the foundation beneath him was no longer solid. As the years passed, Twitty's health declined, and the emotional strain of maintaining two worlds took its toll. When he died in 1993, the public remembered the hits, the duets, and the gentle charisma. Those closest to him remembered something more complex. A man who struggled to reconcile desire, responsibility, and identity. The relationships broken along the way did not heal with time. They simply faded into silence. Conway Twitty's story is not one of public disgrace, but of private erosion. His compulsive relationships did not destroy his career overnight, but they dismantled the stability that career depended on. In the end, he left behind an unmatched catalog of romantic music and a personal legacy marked by unresolved fractures, proving that even the most carefully maintained image cannot protect a life built without restraint. Mickey Gilley. Mickey Gilley's rise was inseparable from a place, a moment, and a lifestyle. As the face of the urban cowboy era, he stood at the center of a cultural shift that turned honky-tonks into mainstream destinations. Gilley's clubs became legends, his records climbed the charts, and his smooth, approachable voice made him one of country music's most bankable stars. To fans, he represented fun without danger, romance without darkness, and success without chaos. Behind that polished image, however, Gilley's personal life drifted steadily toward instability. The very environment that fueled his success, late nights, constant admiration, and easy access, eroded any sense of boundaries. Relationships formed quickly and ended quietly. Emotional commitments overlapped. What appeared from the outside as harmless indulgence slowly hardened into a compulsive pattern. Gilley rarely spoke publicly about these struggles at the time, choosing discretion over confrontation, but those close to him understood the toll it was taking. The consequences were most severe at home. His marriage suffered as absence became routine and trust weakened. Intimacy was replaced by distance, and reconciliation attempts often failed because the underlying behavior never truly changed. Fame allowed him to postpone accountability, but it did not remove it. Over time, personal relationships fractured beyond repair. The private cost of maintaining a public image grew heavier with each passing year. Professionally, the damage unfolded gradually. Gilley remained successful through much of the 1980s, but the momentum slowed. His focus wavered. Club operations, touring demands, and personal distractions pulled him in conflicting directions. Industry confidence softened. While he was never fully abandoned by Nashville, he lost the sense of inevitability that once surrounded his career. Opportunities still came, but they no longer arrived automatically. A turning point arrived through physical trauma rather than personal reckoning. A serious injury later in life affected his ability to perform, forcing reflection that success had long postponed. With distance came clarity. Gilley acknowledged that the lifestyle he once embraced had extracted a price far higher than he expected. Some relationships could not be repaired. Others survived only as memories of what might have been. Mickey Gilley's story illustrates a quieter form of destruction. There was no single scandal, no dramatic exile, no public collapse. Instead, there was erosion. Compulsive relationships did not end his career in flames. They hollowed it out slowly, undermining the stability that sustained long-term success. When the spotlight finally dimmed, Gilley remained respected, but the personal cost was unmistakable. His legacy stands as a reminder that even the most charming version of excess carries consequences that fame cannot soften.
Billy Ray Cyrus.
Billy Ray Cyrus rose to fame almost overnight. When Achy Breaky Heart exploded in the early 1990s, he became one of the most recognizable faces in country music. The success was overwhelming. Stadium tours, nonstop media attention, and a sudden transformation from working musician to global celebrity reshaped his life at a speed few artists are prepared to handle. Cyrus was marketed as a clean-cut, family-oriented star, a symbol of accessible, mainstream country appeal. Behind that image, however, his personal life struggled to withstand the pressure. Fame placed constant strain on his marriage and family, while long stretches on the road created emotional distance that never fully closed. Over time, multiple extramarital relationships surfaced, eventually becoming public through divorce filings and interviews. These were not isolated incidents, but part of a pattern that reflected a growing inability to separate validation from intimacy. Admiration blurred into entitlement, and boundaries slowly collapsed. The consequences were deeply personal and painfully public. His marriage ended after years of instability, marked by reconciliation attempts that ultimately failed. The breakdown affected not only his spouse, but his children as well, creating lasting emotional fallout. Cyrus later admitted that he had underestimated the damage his choices caused, particularly to his family unit. Trust, once broken repeatedly, proved impossible to restore fully. The image of the devoted family man unraveled in full view of the public. Professionally, the impact followed. While Cyrus never disappeared entirely, his position in country music weakened significantly. Industry insiders viewed him as unfocused, pulled between personal turmoil and career reinvention. His attempts to redefine himself musically often coincided with periods of personal upheaval, preventing sustained momentum. Opportunities shifted away from country radio toward television appearances and crossover ventures, reflecting a career searching for stability rather than direction. Unlike some artists whose downfall was sudden, Cyrus's decline unfolded slowly. Fame did not abandon him outright, but it changed shape. The respect once granted automatically now required reinvention and explanation. His legacy became fragmented, defined less by musical influence and more by public narratives surrounding his personal life. Even as later successes brought renewed visibility, the fractures beneath remained visible. In retrospect, Billy Ray Cyrus's story is one of imbalance rather than scandal alone. Sex-driven compulsions did not destroy his career in a single blow, but they destabilized the foundation it stood on. The cost was measured in broken trust, strained family bonds, and a career that never fully recovered its original footing. His experience underscores a recurring truth in country music history. Sudden fame magnifies unresolved impulses, and without restraint, personal collapse often follows public triumph. Toby Keith. Toby Keith built his career on confidence, control, and an unshakable public persona. He was outspoken, commercially dominant, and fiercely independent, a songwriter who turned blunt honesty into stadium anthems. At his peak, Keith was one of the most powerful figures in country music, capable of launching hits without Nashville's approval. To fans, he projected certainty. To the industry, he appeared untouchable. Away from the spotlight, however, that sense of control did not always extend to his personal life. Keith never publicly labeled himself with addiction of any kind, but those close to him acknowledged a long pattern of excess that followed his rise to fame. Long tours, constant admiration, and a lifestyle built around indulgence blurred personal boundaries. Relationships outside his marriage became an open secret in industry circles. These were not tabloid-driven scandals, but sustained behaviors that quietly strained everything behind the scenes. The cost was paid largely in private. Keith's marriage endured, but not without deep fractures. Periods of distance, emotional absence, and repeated stress created a household defined by endurance rather than stability. Fame insulated him from immediate consequences, allowing behavior to continue without public reckoning. Unlike artists whose personal lives collapsed publicly, Keith's status delayed accountability. Success functioned as a shield, not a solution. Professionally, the effects surfaced gradually. While Keith remained a hitmaker, his reputation inside the industry grew increasingly complicated. Executives and collaborators described a man driven by ego and impulse, difficult to rein in. His refusal to compromise creatively mirrored his unwillingness to self-regulate personally. Over time, relationships with labels, radio, and corporate partners became transactional rather than trusting. Power replaced goodwill. As the years passed, Keith's career shifted from dominance to maintenance. He remained visible, but no longer central. His brand relied heavily on provocation and bravado, masking a growing isolation from Nashville's inner circle. When health struggles later emerged, they forced a slowdown that success had long postponed. With distance came reflection. Those closest to him acknowledged that the lifestyle he once embraced had exacted a personal toll that fame could not offset. Toby Keith's story stands apart from more explosive downfalls. His sex-driven excesses did not erase his legacy, but they hollowed out its foundation. What survived was the music and the image. What suffered was the private life built beneath it. In the end, Keith's experience reveals a quieter truth. Dominance can delay consequences, but it cannot cancel them. Even the most powerful careers are vulnerable when personal restraint is treated as optional. Charlie Rich. Charlie Rich was never supposed to fit neatly into country music, yet he conquered it anyway. A classically trained pianist with a deep love for jazz, blues, and soul, Rich stood apart from his peers. When he finally broke through in the early 1970s, his success was explosive. The Most Beautiful Girl turned him into a superstar overnight, and for a brief period, he became one of the most recognizable and respected voices in the genre. To the public, Rich appeared refined, emotional, and deeply romantic. Privately, his life was far less controlled than his image suggested. Rich struggled for years with compulsive behavior, particularly in his relationships. Fame intensified long-standing patterns of excess that had existed even before his breakthrough. Long nights, constant temptation, and an inability to regulate desire created a personal life defined by instability. Although his marriage survived longer than many expected, it endured repeated strain caused by infidelity, emotional withdrawal, and destructive routines that never fully stopped. Unlike artists who sought chaos, Rich appeared overwhelmed by it. Those close to him described a man who oscillated between deep sensitivity and total self-indulgence. Intimacy became tangled with escape. Relationships outside his marriage were not always public, but they were persistent. What made Rich's situation especially damaging was his inability to separate private collapse from professional responsibility. Emotional turmoil bled into every part of his life. The consequences soon reached his career. Alcohol, already a problem, worsened alongside his unstable personal behavior. Missed opportunities, erratic appearances, and unpredictable conduct made industry executives uneasy. His infamous onstage moment at the CMA Awards, where he publicly burned the envelope announcing the next entertainer of the year, symbolized a man unraveling in full view of the industry. Behind the spectacle was a deeper collapse, rooted in years of unchecked impulses. As Nashville quietly withdrew its support, Rich found himself isolated. Radio airplay declined. Labels lost patience. The man who once embodied crossover success became increasingly irrelevant to the mainstream he had briefly dominated. His personal life offered no refuge. Trust had eroded. Relationships fractured. The excess that once felt manageable now defined him entirely. In later years, Rich's health deteriorated rapidly. Diabetes, alcoholism, and emotional exhaustion left little room for recovery. When he died in 1995, he was remembered by many as a tragic figure rather than the revolutionary talent he had been. His compulsive relationships were never framed as scandal, but they contributed to a broader pattern of self-destruction that dismantled both his personal life and career stability. Charlie Rich's story is one of quiet tragedy. He did not fall because he lacked talent or opportunity. He fell because restraint never arrived in time. His legacy endures in recordings that still ache with sincerity, while his life stands as a reminder that sensitivity without discipline can become another form of vulnerability. Mel Tillis. Mel Tillis was one of country music's most quietly influential figures. A prolific songwriter, a respected performer, and a familiar television presence, he built a career that spanned decades without courting scandal. His stutter, which disappeared when he sang, became part of his public charm. Audiences saw humility, warmth, and stability. Tillis appeared to represent balance in a business often defined by excess. Behind that calm exterior, however, his personal life followed a very different rhythm. In later interviews and autobiographical reflections, Tillis acknowledged a long pattern of womanizing that accompanied his success. Fame brought opportunity, and opportunity gradually became habit. Relationships overlapped. Emotional commitments were made lightly and broken quietly. What appeared to outsiders as harmless flirtation evolved into compulsive behavior that undermined the foundations of his private life. The consequences were most visible within his family. His marriage endured significant strain as trust eroded over time. Absence, secrecy, and emotional distance replaced stability. Tillis was not violent or publicly destructive, but his behavior created a persistent sense of insecurity for those closest to him. Reconciliation attempts often failed because the underlying pattern remained unchanged. The damage accumulated slowly, without headlines, but with lasting impact. Professionally, Tillis's reputation remained largely intact, but not untouched. Industry insiders were aware of his personal instability, even if fans were not. His image as a dependable figure softened behind the scenes. While he continued to write hits and perform successfully, the sense of complete trust that once surrounded him weakened. Opportunities still came, but the unquestioned confidence he once enjoyed faded quietly. He was respected, but no longer idealized. As time passed, Tillis began to reflect more openly on the cost of his choices. Age and perspective brought acknowledgement rather than denial. He spoke about regret, not in dramatic terms, but with the wariness of someone who understood consequences too late to undo them. Some relationships healed partially, others were lost permanently. Fame had allowed him to delay reckoning, but not escape it. Unlike many of his peers, Mel Tillis did not experience a public collapse. There were no arrests, no industry exiles, no explosive scandals. His destruction was internal and relational. Compulsive behavior did not erase his career, but it fractured the personal life that career depended on. The price was paid in broken trust and emotional distance rather than lost charts or contracts. Mel Tillis' story serves as a quieter warning. Success does not need chaos to cause harm. Sometimes it is the absence of boundaries, sustained over years, that dismantles everything slowly. His music endures, his influence remains undeniable, but his personal legacy carries the weight of relationships weakened by impulses left unchecked.